How does someone become so intimate with God that they can laugh at demons? What kind of prayer life transforms a sickly young woman into one of history's most powerful mystics? And why did Teresa's spiritual battles echo through the centuries as a blueprint for anyone seeking deeper faith? This is the story of Saint Teresa of Ávila, the mystic who proved that the spiritual life is not escape from reality, but engagement with the deepest reality of all. If you've ever wondered whether prayer really changes things, let this story show you its true power. And if you want more stories that reveal how ordinary lives are transformed into extraordinary faith, hit like and subscribe for more. In the golden hills of Castile, Spain, in 1515, a girl was born who would one day shake heaven and earth through sheer force of prayer. Teresa de Cepeda y Ahumada entered the world during the Spanish Inquisition, an age of religious wars and mystical revival. Teresa's childhood revealed the intensity that would mark her entire life. At age 7, she convinced her brother Rodrigo to run away with her to the land of the Moors, hoping to be martyred for their faith. They made it only to the town's edge before their uncle found them, but the incident showed Teresa's spiritual hunger. Her parents filled their home with religious books and practices. Teresa devoured stories of saints and martyrs, dreaming of glorious deaths that would catapult her to heaven. But she also loved beautiful clothes, romantic novels, and the attention of young men. When Teresa was 14, her mother died, leaving her devastated. The loss threw her into spiritual crisis that would last for years. She turned to the Virgin Mary as replacement mother, but also to increasingly worldly pursuits as numbing medicine. Her worried father sent her to convent school. There, Teresa encountered nuns whose lives balanced contemplation with joy, devotion with intelligence. For the first time, she seriously considered religious life not as escape from the world, but as deeper engagement with ultimate reality. At 18, despite her father's opposition, Teresa entered the Carmelite convent of the Incarnation in Ávila. She thought she was choosing the safe path of religious life. Instead, she was walking into a spiritual battlefield where she would face enemies she never knew existed. The war for Teresa's soul was about to begin. The convent of the Incarnation shocked Teresa. Instead of fervent mystics, she found relaxed religious atmosphere, reflecting the age's spiritual mediocrity. The nuns were good women, but their life was more social than spiritual. They received visitors regularly, maintained outside friendships, and lived with comfort that made true contemplation difficult. Teresa fit this environment perfectly. She was charming, intelligent, popular among nuns and visitors. But beneath her social success, she was spiritually starving. Prayer that had once seemed promising became increasingly difficult and dry. For nearly 20 years, Teresa lived what she later called a lukewarm religious life. She prayed when required, fulfilled duties adequately, but experienced little fire. Worse, she was plagued by illnesses that provided convenient excuses for avoiding spiritual depth. The turning point came through suffering. In 1538, Teresa became so ill she nearly died. For 4 days, she lay unconscious while her community prepared her funeral. When she awakened, she was partially paralyzed and in constant pain. Forced into inactivity, Teresa had no choice but to confront her spiritual emptiness. She began reading seriously, particularly St. Augustine's Confessions, whose struggle with worldliness resonated with her experience. More significant was her growing awareness of intellectual visions, supernatural experiences, unlike anything she'd been taught to expect. These weren't theatrical or dramatic, but profoundly intimate encounters with divine love that left her both comforted and terrified. Teresa's problem was unreliable spiritual direction. Priests she consulted were either too inexperienced or too skeptical. Some suggested her visions came from the devil rather than God, leaving Teresa in agonizing uncertainty. But she was learning that mystical life isn't about dramatic experiences, but gradual soul transformation through persistent prayer and complete surrender. She was also discovering that anyone seeking to grow closer to God will face opposition from spiritual forces, preferring souls to remain in mediocrity and darkness. The real battle was just beginning. In 1554, when Teresa was 39, she experienced her second conversion, a spiritual awakening so profound it divided her life into before and after. The catalyst was surprisingly simple. She encountered a statue of Christ suffering during his passion. "I felt so keenly aware of how poorly I had thanked him for those wounds," she wrote, "that my heart seemed to break. I threw myself down before him with the greatest outpouring of tears, begging him to strengthen me once and for all." This encounter marked the beginning of Teresa's mature mystical life. Prayer, difficult and dry for 20 years, suddenly became her existence's center. She began experiencing passive contemplation, prayer so deep her own efforts disappeared, replaced by direct communion with God. But with these graces came new challenges. Teresa's mystical experiences became more frequent and intense, including ecstasies that left her physically suspended in air, a phenomenon that both amazed and mortified her. The devil, Teresa discovered, doesn't give up easily on souls held in spiritual mediocrity. As her prayer life deepened, she found herself under intense spiritual attack. She experienced terrifying visions of demons, periods of crushing darkness, and temptations designed specifically for her weaknesses. But Teresa was learning to fight back. When demons appeared in her cell, she would seize the nearest flask of holy water and fling it in their faces as if it were fire itself, commanding them to leave in Christ's name. When spiritual darkness threatened to overwhelm her, she would cling to God's love revealed in prayer. "I have never been afraid of demons," she wrote, "for they are cowards. They cannot move a finger unless God permits it." Most importantly, Teresa discovered that mystical experience must be tested by its fruits. True encounters with God always produced greater humility, deeper love for others, and more perfect obedience. Demonic deceptions led to pride, confusion, and neglect of ordinary duties. What does it mean to fight the devil with prayer? And how do you know when your spiritual experiences come from God rather than deception? As Teresa's prayer life deepened, she understood that mystical experience wasn't private luxury, but calling to spiritual combat. The closer she drew to God, the more fiercely she was attacked by forces seeking to drag her back into mediocrity or outright deception. Teresa's descriptions of these battles are among the most vivid in Christian literature. She wrote of demons appearing as hideous creatures that filled her with terror, but also of learning to face them with confidence rooted in Christ's victory. Her method of spiritual combat was surprisingly practical. When demons tormented her, she would make the sign of the cross, sprinkle holy water, and command them to leave in Jesus' name. When they attacked with doubts, she would respond with acts of faith. When they tempted her with pride over mystical experiences, she would immediately confess her unworthiness. But Teresa's greatest weapon was prayer itself. Not just ecstatic experiences that drew attention, but patient, persistent conversation with God, sustaining her through consolations and desolations. She developed the 4 waters of prayer, systematic description of souls progressing from vocal prayer through meditation to passive contemplation and mystical union. As Teresa's reputation spread, people sought her counsel. She discovered extraordinary gifts for spiritual direction, ability to read souls and guide them toward authentic relationship with God. Her advice was always practical, focused on virtue growth rather than extraordinary experiences. "It is clear," Teresa wrote, "that the devil is much more afraid of one person, however weak, who has genuine love of God, than of many others who are lukewarm." Teresa realized the devil wasn't just interested in destroying individual souls, but corrupting religious communities and institutions. If she was going to serve God faithfully, she would need to fight for reform not just in her heart, but in religious life structures themselves. In 1560, Teresa began experiencing visions that would change her life and Carmelite history. In these supernatural encounters, she saw Christ himself, calling her to restore Carmelite life to original fervor through founding Reformed communities. The vision seemed impossible. Teresa was a simple nun, with no authority, no resources, no obvious path toward radical reform. Worse, founding new convents was controversial in 16th century Spain, where authorities were suspicious of religious innovation. But Teresa had learned to trust God's voice in prayer, even when it led to seemingly impossible undertakings. She began quietly working toward founding what would become the Descalced Carmelites, communities dedicated to returning to contemplative prayer and evangelical poverty. Opposition was immediate and fierce. The nuns at Incarnation were scandalized. Church authorities questioned Teresa's visions and competence. Civil officials worried about economic implications. But the greatest opposition came from spiritual sources. As Teresa worked toward reform, she found herself under more intense demonic attack than ever. The devil was particularly threatened by communities dedicated to deep prayer, because such communities produced saints who could effectively oppose his influence. The foundation of St. Joseph's Convent in Ávila in 1562 marked the beginning of Teresa's active apostolate. Despite enormous opposition, she had established a small community dedicated to contemplative prayer, mutual charity, and evangelical poverty. The experiment was immediately successful. Over the next 20 years, Teresa would found 16 more Reformed convents throughout Spain, traveling constantly despite poor health and fierce opposition. Each foundation required spiritual battles against forces determined to prevent authentic religious life spread. Teresa discovered that institutional reform required the same weapons as personal spiritual combat: prayer, discernment, courage, and absolute trust in God's providence. Her success proved that authentic spirituality and practical effectiveness were not opposites, but partners. How do you reform institutions while fighting spiritual battles? And what happens when your private prayer life becomes public warfare? As Teresa's reform movement spread throughout Spain, she began work on what would become her masterpiece, The Interior Castle, written in just 2 months in 1577. The book would become one of the most influential works of mystical theology in Christian history. Teresa's metaphor was simple but profound. The soul is like a crystal castle with 7 mansions, each representing a stage in the spiritual journey toward the center where God dwells. As souls progress through prayer and virtue, they experience increasingly intimate union with divine love. But Teresa's castle was not a peaceful retreat. Each mansion represented not just deeper intimacy with God, but more intense spiritual warfare. The closer souls came to the center, the more fiercely they were attacked. In the first mansions, Teresa wrote, there are still many venomous creatures that come in with the soul. But as one gets closer to where His Majesty dwells, these creatures have less power. The genius of Teresa's teaching was her insistence that mystical experience must be tested by practical fruits. True union with God always produced greater love for others, more perfect humility, and more faithful service. Souls who claimed mystical experiences but remained proud or uncharitable were deceiving themselves. The Interior Castle became Teresa's most effective weapon against spiritual deception. By providing clear criteria for authentic mystical experience, she helped countless souls distinguish between genuine encounters with God and demonic counterfeits. The woman who had once thrown holy water at demons had become something far more dangerous to evil forces. A teacher who could help souls recognize and resist spiritual deception while growing in authentic union with God. By 1582, Teresa had accomplished the impossible. Her Reformed Carmelite communities were flourishing throughout Spain, producing contemplatives whose prayer supported the Church's mission. She had written books that would guide souls for centuries and proven that mystical experience and institutional reform could work together. On the 4th of October 1582, Teresa died in Alba de Tormes while traveling to establish yet another foundation. Her last words were characteristic. "My Lord, it is time to move on. Well then, may your will be done. The hour that I have longed for has come." Even her death bore supernatural marks. Witnesses reported that her body remained incorrupt and gave off sweet fragrance that filled the entire convent. Teresa was canonized in 1622, just 40 years after her death. In 1970, Pope Paul VI declared her a Doctor of the Church, the first woman to receive this honor. But Teresa's ultimate victory was not official recognition, but the countless souls who found their way to God through her teachings. Her writings on prayer, mystical experience, and spiritual discernment became essential reading for anyone serious about spiritual life. Today, Saint Teresa remains one of the most influential spiritual teachers in Christian history. Her psychological insights into spiritual development have influenced modern psychotherapy. Her understanding of mystical experience and mental health was centuries ahead of its time. In our age of spiritual confusion, Teresa's criteria for authentic mystical experience provide essential guidance. True encounters with God always produce greater humility, deeper love for others, and more faithful service. Experiences leading to pride or selfishness should be treated with suspicion. Teresa also speaks powerfully to modern struggles with prayer and contemplation. In an age of constant distraction, her teachings on interior life offer both hope and practical direction. Her understanding of spiritual warfare remains equally relevant. The same forces that attacked Teresa continue to operate today. Her methods of combat, confident prayer, use of sacramentals, appeal to church authority, and focus on practical virtue provide tested weapons for souls facing similar battles. Perhaps most importantly, Teresa demonstrates that sainthood is not about extraordinary experiences, but about ordinary love, lived extraordinarily well. Her mystical encounters were always ordered toward greater service to others. Saint Teresa of Ávila, the mystic who fought the devil with prayer, reminds us that authentic spirituality involves both ascending to God in contemplation and descending to serve others in love. Her witness echoes across centuries. The highest prayer and most practical service are not competitors, but partners in Christian life. The woman who once threw holy water at demons teaches us that spiritual combat is real, prayer is powerful, and anyone willing to seek God seriously will find both the greatest consolations and fiercest battles this side of heaven. Saint Teresa shows us that prayer is not retreat from the world, but battle within it and victory through it.